I'm at 30 Chester Street. This Georgian-style home was built in 1799. Many people have lived here, but let's find out what made the Kent House name stick.
The house was built by Amos Kent in 1799. This was the year that President George Washington died, and it is said that he was so distraught over his death that Amos had the frieze around the top of the living room painted black for a memorial. Amos Kent was a famous lawyer. He had a daughter named Abigail born in the house. She becomes a first lady for the White House. Later in this video, I will explain how this all happened. The Hagans, which now own the Kent House, have a room called the Abigail Room. There is very little information on this house and only a couple of photos. Later in this video, Dick Lewis gives a great account of living in this house. His grandparents and parents owned it starting 100 years ago. After Amos Kent owned this house, it was bought by Captain Samuel Aiken. It is called the Aiken House for over a century, and some still refer to it as the Aiken House. Captain Samuel Aiken was a Revolutionary War officer. Paperwork was found that he was reimbursed by Congress for a coat worth $15 lost in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Samuel Aiken's daughter, Nancy, married John Noyes, another prominent Chester resident who lived at 96 Chester Street. This postcard shows the barn, which no longer stands. This photo shows the back of the house 100 years ago. The home was owned by Colonel Paul Traver, also, who had beautiful gardens. The home was white and considered a showplace. A following owner, Dennis Jolliker, added the white picket fence with an automatic gate. Pat Hagen told me that Catherine Smith, daughter of Howard K. Smith from ABC, lived in the house shortly before they did. Pat Hagen shared these photos of the home from the mid-1900s. Notice the Suffolk door latch in the living room. This is a photo of the Hagen's kitchen fireplace today with the beehive oven. Notice the original crane which held the cooking pots. As with all old homes not kept up, they can turn to disrepair quickly, and Dick Lewis later will describe this in the video. But now, let's go on to some fun stories.
Amos Kent was a lawyer. He was also a senator. He was very successful financially. I love the story that I found about him and Matthew Thornton. Matthew Thornton was one of the New Hampshire signers of the Declaration of Independence. Amos Kent and his family of 6 were sleighing down the Merrimack River when it fell through the ice with his whole family. Amos kept on going back and forth, trying to save his family members and his unconscious wife, which he was successful in saving, and his 3 children. One of his children was Abigail Kent, which ended up being a first lady for the White House, which will be a story to come. Abigail was born in 1808, so that made her 6 years old when she went through the ice. Matthew Thornton and his wife took them in and warmed them and took care of them. How cool is that? That Matthew Thornton's wife happened to have lived in Chester also.
So how did Abigail Kent, who was born in the Kent House, end up being a first lady? President Franklin Pierce from Concord, New Hampshire, won the presidential Democratic election by a landslide. As President Pierce and his wife Jane, with their son Benny, were traveling from Concord, New Hampshire to Andover, Mass., an axle rod broke on the train and it went off the track, killing their only son, as they had already lost two sons. One, Frankie, died of typhus, and the other died a few days after he was born. Mrs. Pierce was so beside herself she did not attend the inauguration and filled the White House with mourning buntings for 2 years. Just into 3 months of the president's term, Franklin Pierce's vice president died and was not replaced. Mrs. Pierce felt they were doomed. She went into a deep depression and stayed on the top floor of the White House. Her uncle, Robert Means, was a very successful weaver and merchant, and he was rich and famous for his trade. Abigail Kent, who grew up in the Kent house and escaped drowning in the Merrimack River, unlike Amos Kent's sister, which tragically died on that day, married Robert Means and Mrs. Jane Pierce's uncle. They had no children, so Jane Pierce asked if Abigail would come to the White House and presume the First Lady's duties. This is an older photo of Abigail Kent Means. Her father, Amos Kent, died at the age of 50 from alcohol abuse, and he is buried in the Chester Village Cemetery. Abigail is buried in Amherst, where she lived with Robert Means. Abigail inherited her husband's homestead in Amherst, which is one of Amherst's most historical structures. So Chester had a first lady born in the Kent house. How amazing to add this to Chester's great history. The home has proudly stood in Chester's center for 221 years. The original barn, seen on the right, no longer stands.
Okay, this picture is of the east side of the barn, and to the back corner of the barn was the ice house, which was burnt down by my father smoking cigarettes in the sawdust in the ice house when he was a teenager, but they did save the barn. The barn was torn down by myself, Richard Lewis, in probably 1958 because it was leaking pretty badly and the sills were going, and my father didn't have the money to put into it, so we tore it down. And that ended the era of that barn.
This is a photo of Dick's mother and father, Robert and Marilyn Lewis, around 18 years old. They lived in the L of the Kent house, while his grandparents, Ferris and Louise, lived in the front. This is a photo of Dick's lovely grandmother, Louise.
The Kent house, as I remember, as a young person, I had never heard of the Kent family. It was an Aiken house that I had known it as, built in 1799, when my grandfather bought it around the time of the First World War. And it had been abandoned for a number of years. It was in very bad shape. And he was a carpenter, and at the time he was a caretaker for the Frenches and the Vanderbilts. And so he rebuilt it. He redid the L, and he raised chickens, and he was in the real estate business also. He was one of the first principals of the Chester Telephone Company. He had an apple orchard there, and he kept the apple orchard up until the mid-50s. At that point, I say mid-50s, he died in 1953. I think he might have built a lot of the L. There were 2 other chicken houses. He raised chickens. The 2 front bays in each side of the barn were chickens, and he had 2 chicken houses off to the, if you were facing the house from the road, to the right side of the barn. And that was his main profession there. But he did build houses. He was a carpenter. He did build houses around Chester. And he sold it to my father in 1952 or so, before he died. And then my father and mother lived there until 1970, and they sold the house around 1970. And that ended the Lewis family at that location. Sure, the prices paid for the Kent house were, and my grandfather bought it around the time of the First World War, and he paid $1,500 for it, and he sold it to my father in 1953 for $4,500. My father worked at Western Electric at the time, and he probably made $10 a day. So I guess it reflects the price reflects the times. The rooms inside, when this house was built, someone obviously had money. They had beautiful crown moldings in all of the rooms, and the doors were like painted. I don't know if it was a paint or what. They were like a tiger stripe doors, and so this was not something you found in the average log cabin at the time. They had money. Away in the front, when you come in the front door, it had was a hallway. So the stairway was on the right side, and the hallway was on the left side, and that straight into a room in the center of the building. It had like a square room, and all of the rooms connected to that center room. So you could go into that center room, and then you could enter the other rooms. And every room in the main house had a fireplace. In the original, they had those two big chimneys, and so there would have been 4 fireplaces in each one of those chimneys. And yeah, it was quite a house in its day. I mean, but it had those big high ceilings. It was hard to heat. My father would not sell it to me because it was going to cost too much to maintain. He told me he didn't want to sell it to me.
So it had no bathrooms?
No bathrooms in the 1940s. And it had no refrigerators or ice boxes, just hand pump kitchen sinks to get water. And it had a 3-holer in the back of the shed. It was very well done. It was painted. It was wallpapered. It even had a low center stool for the children.
Thank you, Dick, for your great memories of the Aiken Kent house.